On Saturday, March 11th, 1967, a single-engine Cessna departed from Portland, heading toward San Francisco on what was expected to be a fairly short and uneventful journey. But hours into the flight, they unexpectedly encountered a rare and intense storm that led to the plane crashing into the side of a mountain. Amazingly, all passengers survived the initial impact, but what they endured in the following weeks would become one of the longest and most harrowing survival stories in the region's history. An ordeal so significant, it would leave a lasting mark on the aviation industry. This is their chilling tale. Viewer discretion is advised. Accounts mention that Alvin was extremely meticulous about his aircraft, preferring to handle both the cleaning and a significant portion of the maintenance himself. Accompanying him on this journey was 44-year-old Phyllis, a nursing graduate from Northwestern University, along with 15-year-old Carla, who wasn't exactly excited about the trip. She would have much rather spent her weekend with her boyfriend. But since Alvin Jr., a Delta Airlines pilot, had a packed schedule, such chances were rare. So on Saturday, March 11th, 1967, they departed for San Francisco. Despite Alvin's background as an experienced outdoorsman and a cautious pilot, the family's survival kit was somehow left behind. Whether it was forgotten in the rush to meet Alvin Jr. or simply overlooked is unclear, but at the time, it didn't seem important. After all, it was a short and familiar flight path that Alvin had navigated many times. However, this small oversight would soon prove to be incredibly unfortunate. Roughly midway through the trip, Alvin made a standard radio call near Medford, Oregon, approximately 5 miles west of the city. Their next stop was Red Bluff, where they planned to refuel before completing their 860-kilometer journey to San Francisco. While private aviation in the 1960s lacked the sophisticated navigation tools available today, one thing that remains consistent is the use of visual references. Even now, many pilots rely on roads, rivers, railway lines, and other features as visual aids. Essentially, simple paths to follow from the sky. If you've ever seen a Cessna flying alongside a highway while driving, you've witnessed how pilots often use visual landmarks for navigation. Alvin was doing exactly that, relying on his sight to stay on course. But before they could get close to Red Bluff, the weather suddenly turned, taking away any sense of safety Alvin might have had. In a matter of moments, they were engulfed in a full whiteout blizzard. Visibility dropped to zero. Ice began forming on the wings, and strong winds started pushing them west, toward the ocean and away from the landmarks Alvin had been following, even if they were still visible. This is one of the most dangerous situations a civilian pilot can face and accounts for nearly half of all general aviation crashes. It's called VFR into IMC, Visual Flight Rules, into Instrument Meteorological Conditions, which means flying into poor weather conditions while relying solely on visual cues. As you can imagine, it's a deadly combination. Despite Alvin's experience and efforts to stay on course using just a compass, he had no way of knowing they had drifted more than 20 kilometers, 12 miles, off course and into the Trinity Mountains. As the winds grew stronger and the ice heavier, the plane was forced lower, until a mountain suddenly appeared through the storm. With no time to react, Alvin had to make an emergency landing right on the side of a mountain. In most cases, a crash like this would end in tragedy. But against all odds, Alvin managed to land the plane, and incredibly, everyone survived. Thanks to a combination of skill and luck, Alvin had proven he was much more than just a casual hobbyist. However, despite surviving the crash, their real struggle was only beginning. They were now completely alone, with no idea where they had landed. As Alvin unbuckled himself from the pilot's seat and tried to orient himself, his first instinct might have been to check for any scent of leaking aviation fuel. But what would have quickly become a more urgent concern was his own condition. A broken arm, several crushed ribs on his right side, pain in his spine, a gash on his chin, and 3 cuts across his forehead. Even breathing must have been painful, let alone crawling inside the wreckage of a crashed plane. Phyllis was in even worse shape. She had sustained a broken left wrist and ankle, cuts on her right hand, and possible brain trauma causing severe disorientation. making it nearly impossible for her to move around or use her nursing expertise. Perhaps the only real stroke of luck, beyond surviving the crash at all, was that Carla, though badly bruised and shaken, had no broken bones. As the only one able to move properly, she was now essential to their chances of survival. At first, Alvin may have believed they could manage. He had experience with outdoor living. Phyllis was a trained nurse, and Carla could still function physically. He probably kicked himself for not packing the survival kit, but overall, it still seemed possible to make it through. That hope likely began to fade, though, when he reached for the plane's console, only to find both radios had been destroyed in the crash. This meant they had no way to call for help, and the condition of the plane was terrible. It had flipped onto its left side, the windows were shattered, and the top door wouldn't shut properly, letting in the freezing winter winds. Without the survival kit, which contained essentials like emergency food, a hunting rifle, and a flare gun, they needed assistance more than ever. Unfortunately, due to the situation, they could only wait to be discovered on the side of a mountain in a blizzard by rescuers who had no idea where to look. Hours later, when the plane didn't arrive in Red Bluff, a series of alerts were sent out, eventually turning into a major rescue operation involving the Air Force, Civil Air Patrol, and the Oregon Pilots Association. Meanwhile, the weather was just as uncooperative for the search teams as it was for the stranded family. To make matters worse, the rescuers had no clue where exactly the plane had crashed between Medford and Red Bluff, a stretch of 245 kilometers, 152 miles. Even more concerning was how far off course the plane might have been pushed. If searchers assumed a 20-kilometer deviation, that would mean combing through 4,900 square kilometers of wilderness. Expanding that radius to 30 kilometers would require searching a staggering 7,350 square kilometers, mostly dense forest, rugged mountains, deep lakes, and uninhabited land. What nobody knew at the time was that this was exactly how far they'd need to search. The plane had crashed on the north slope of Bully Choop Mountain, 30 kilometers west of Redding, one of the navigational markers en route to Red Bluff. Even worse, the crash site was forested and rapidly being buried under continuous snowfall, making the plane nearly impossible to spot. Back at the crash site, Phyllis awoke the next morning with frostbite on her toes, and the entire family was in miserable shape. By that point, they must have realized that though they had survived the crash, the wait ahead would be brutal. All they had for food was what amounted to a single picnic: a few sandwiches, 3 jars of jelly, some lemon drops, 2 bags of M&Ms, some milk of magnesia tablets, and vitamin pills. It wasn't much, but it was something, and they wisely started rationing immediately. They also used sheets and clothing to cover the broken windows, but the wind constantly fought their efforts to create even minimal shelter. Back in San Francisco, Alvin Jr. quickly learned about the crash, as he was expecting their arrival. But unlike many in his situation, he was actually in a position to help. He went to Redding and immediately volunteered for the search operation, joining flight missions to find them, something he'd done before in the Air Force. Ironically, the family had almost everything necessary to survive, except a functioning radio. As the days passed, nothing improved. The storm lingered, and clear skies were rare. Maybe a few hours here and there, but seldom a full day. Rescue flights had to maneuver around the storm, working through openings and retreating when new fronts arrived. On the 3rd day post-crash, Carla tried to leave the plane to search nearby, but the thick snow and zero visibility forced her back, and she even lost her shoes in the process. 2 days later, making it 5 days since the crash, Alvin felt well enough to attempt movement, despite the snow still falling. It was chest deep by then. Walking felt more like swimming, and staying dry or warm was impossible. But knowing they were running out of food, they were down to the last jar of jelly, he knew he had to make an attempt. So he bundled up and set off down the mountain, hoping he chose the right direction. Carla and Phyllis could hear him calling for a while until he shouted that he'd safely crossed a gully. After that, he was out of earshot, and mother and daughter were left alone, hoping he'd find someone. Above them, Alvin Jr. shared that same hope. By then, He was part of a 165-person team with 3 ground units and 45 search aircraft. Despite the impossible odds, he refused to quit. Every day in stormy weather, he continued flying. But then another week passed, and Alvin never returned. No rescuers found him either. At one point, Phyllis wrote in the margins of the flight notebook, Carla had been using it as a diary, that she was afraid he hadn't made it. By the end of the second week, rescue efforts were called off after nearly 600 flight hours and hundreds of missions. But Alvin Jr. kept going, flying search missions despite the weather. And this continued for 8 weeks. Meanwhile, Carla and Phyllis used the plane's upholstery to make playing cards. They continued to do things they used to do with Alvin, making wish lists of food, gifts, and places to visit once they were rescued. But hope is hard to hold on to after over a month without real food, just melting ice with body heat for drinking water. On April 30th, nearly 2 months post-crash, Carla wrote, "This is my 16th birthday. I hope you're happy, search and rescue. You haven't found us yet." Despite the sarcasm, it was clear her birthday wish was to be rescued. And if anyone had earned the right to sarcasm, it was her. Carla circled each passing day on the notebook's calendar and regularly noted the weather. Out of all the days since the crash, only 2 were completely clear and sunny. The bad weather was unrelenting. Then, on May 4th, came the final entry. It was a bright, drizzly day. We were completely drenched. After this, the calendar entries stopped, and one final note mentioned that they were growing too weak to continue updating the calendar, indicating they would likely survive only a little longer. The exact moment of their death is unknown, but eventually, they passed away. Their bodies lay frozen and still, but the story of their ordeal continued on. Although they survived for at least 54 days, Alvin Jr. kept flying mission after mission for 107 days. It wasn't until June 26th that he was finally forced to stop searching, as his funds were running out, and he needed to return to work. Months went by until the first week of October when Floyd Bowling, a hunter looking for deer, discovered the wreckage of the plane. The plane was buried in trees, 5,000 feet up the mountain, in an area so dense that there was almost no chance of a rescue flight spotting it, even with more than 4 feet of snow on the ground. Upon searching the area, they found the remains of 2 bodies that had been scattered by animals, along with a book, the FAA flight log that Carla had used as a makeshift diary, documenting their time in the mountains. Alvin Jr. returned to Redding and sold the contents of the diary to the Saturday Evening Post to share Carla's story with the public. He was joined by his 2 brothers, and together they ventured into the woods to camp at the crash site while continuing their search for their father. They were certain he had to be somewhere nearby and needed to find him. Some reports say they continued to hope he was still alive, but the crash site was only 8 miles from the nearest highway. If Alvin had been able to move, he would likely have been found by then. Whether this was an embellishment or the brothers not wanting to admit the inevitable is unclear. But ultimately, they found nothing and had to return to their families. It wasn't until September 23, 1969, 2 years later, that 2 deer hunters stumbled upon Alvin's remains, revealing just how close he had come and how hard he had tried. Alvin's body was only about 40 feet from the road, and it seemed he had been drawn to the telephone poles along it. Before he passed, he made an arrow on the ground using tree branches, hoping someone would notice it and find the crash site. He also hung his gloves on a tree, thinking they might catch someone's eye as they drove by, but no one saw them. He was only about a quarter mile, 400 meters from the crash site when he froze to death. It's tragically possible that his sons had walked through that very field several times, missing him in the tall grass. 2 years later, all that hunters found were scraps of clothing, bones, 2 shoes turning to moss, a ballpoint pen from the Clifford Hotel engraved with Alvin's name, his glasses, and oddly, a camera. Perhaps Alvin had intended to use it to document his path in hopes of guiding rescuers to the plane, but there was no indication that any film had survived. In the aftermath, Alvin Jr. was openly critical of the rescue efforts, calling them disorganized, poorly managed, and ill-prepared. He felt they gave up too soon and could have done much better. Additionally, steps could have been taken to prevent the tragedy. At the time, civil aviation didn't require emergency locator beacons. They were optional extras, costing anywhere from $1 to $300, with some models going up to $800. If the family had had one, they would have been rescued within hours, with the nearest road only a half-mile away from the crash. Carla's diary played a pivotal role in this. Senator Peter Dominic of Colorado read her story and, as a former U.S. Air Force member, could easily empathize with the anguish of searching for a loved one month after month. With the support of his colleagues, including Senator Warren Magnuson from Washington State, he introduced Carla's Law, which mandated emergency locator transmitters for civil aviation, just as they were required on commercial planes. Finally, in December of 1970, President Nixon signed Federal Aviation Requirement 91.207 into law. By 1973, it became mandatory for all civil aviation aircraft using government-funded airports to be equipped with emergency beacons. Carla's journal and her family's efforts indirectly saved countless lives by ensuring that future victims would be located more quickly. Her tragic diary humanized a pressing issue and helped bring about change. We should all be so fortunate. Thank you for watching. Thanks again, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one.